Good evening, everybody. A very warm welcome. My name is Oliver Schmidtke. I'm the director of the Center for Global Studies, and we have the pleasure of hosting tonight's event, looking at democracy in turbulent times. And this is one of a series of events this week that looks critically at the state of democracy, where we're at, what are the challenges, and what we can do. And let me say that I'm very grateful that we are in this beautiful facility here with a Stream of Consciousness company whose mandate it is to amplify public debates into the broader public, and that's where our interests very much intersect. The need to get the word out also about research, about public debates, and we're very happy to be in this facility today. Let me thank Rebecca Nellums for having facilitated this and secured this grant. We are very happy about this collaboration. We hope we can do this again in the future. Also, great shout out thanks to all the volunteers, graduate students who have helped us to put this together, and also the generous funding that we received from the European Union that funds 2 projects that look at media outreach and issues of democracy, and whose help will provide also some of the food that we're waiting for a bit later on. We will be live streamed, so you will be recorded. When you raise questions later on, please be aware that you would need to use a mic, as I do at the moment. However, although we are widely, largely online and in the ether space, I still want to recognize that we currently meet on the unceded territory of the Lekwungen-speaking people, in particular the Esquimalt and the Songhees nations, whose traditional relationship to this land continues, and also the Wasanish-speaking people on whose land the Center for Global Studies and the University of UVic resides. We will address some of the legacies of indigenous democratic practices, of community practices a bit later on in this week, so we're very glad to draw also on their expertise when it comes to addressing some of the questions that we will be taking on tonight. The format for tonight is that we have 2 panels with a short interruption during which we show a little video clip. We start off with a reflection on the role of media in particular. And I think considering the state of our democracy, there's a good reason to look at public discourse and media as an entry point. Because if you think about what is at the very core of democratic practices, it is really the exchange, the deliberation of citizens in the pursuit of their interests, the articulation of preferences, and also holding those in power to account through a critical reflection of what is happening in society and in politics. And those of you trained in political theory, you might be aware of how Jürgen Habermas, in a seminal study on the structural transformation of the public sphere, really went back to look at how people interacted in communicative practices. He basically traced back the roots of democracy to how people interact in the public arena, even in coffee houses and so forth. Sure enough, we have moved beyond these kind of arenas of public deliberation, but to a certain degree, the same principles. How can we instigate a rational, well-informed public discourse that then also transfers power to citizens vis-a-vis the power that is vested in government or in private business and so forth? In the 20th century, in the 21st century, this dynamic has moved to the media, right? We now look at mass media as some of the 4th branch of government. The media that we trust to establish a form of checks and balances when it comes to controlling power. And if you look at the current state of media intervention, public deliberation, there are 3 key challenges I very briefly want to highlight before I come to this panel. The first one being, and we are all aware if you open the newspaper or your internet, the talk about fake news, about no trust in the media, the suggestion that all media are being biased, even to the degree, and you can basically describe fake media as always a strategy to discredit whoever is critical of you. But what we see at the moment is a real attempt to undermine the very legitimacy of the media as such. You know, the media as the quote-unquote enemy of the people. You know, the so-called lying press, as the right-wing nationalists try to portray it. I think that is a fundamental challenge to the very notion of authority vested in media. The second point that I would like to highlight is how the medium of media discourse, public discourse, has changed. You know, it used to be all, you know, Mr. Mansbridge, CBC News in the evening, we all watched, and there was a common reference point. We now have a diversification of channels of news, how we receive our news, and how we interact in public debates. And in this respect, the internet, social media, has established a fascinating, at times enabling format for this kind of deliberation, but as we've seen lately as well, it has created a highly divisive public arena when it comes to public discourse, rational debate. You know, there's lots of hatred that is invested in some of these arenas of debate online, some kind of echo chambers for those people who simply want to see their own position to be reinforced, and that is a challenge. And the last one before I come to the panel is the material reality of media at the moment, the concentration of ownership of those media outlets in less and less hands, the dying off of small presses on the ground, and with it also a gradual a tendency to undermine the very material existence of investigative, independent journalism that needs a certain business model also to survive. So when we reflect, and now I come to our distinguished panel, when we reflect on the role of media, the role of academia as well to engage in public discourse, keep this in mind that we are at a critical threshold in terms of redefining, you know, ways of how we conduct this public discourse, legitimate actors and legitimate channels of conducting this. So let me very briefly introduce our panel from from your left on, you know, right next to me is Tom Jones, who is an historian and a postdoctoral fellow who has just won a very prestigious Marie Curie Sklodowska fellowship and will be at the European Union, European Institute in Florence. Tom is a scholar of youth movements and with a particular emphasis on Central Eastern Europe, and his expertise will also shed light on some of those debates in certain parts of Europe in this respect. He has done also quite a bit of media work in foreign policy and open democracy. And next to Tom, you have Laurel Collins, who might be well known to most of you here. Laurel has been Victoria City Councillor since 2018. And before this, Laurel has been, also at the moment, she's instructing at UVic in the Social Justice and Inequality program. And you have had many hats before this. You've been the executive director of the Victoria Multicultural Society before, and worked for 2 years as a program coordinator for the Victoria Women's in Need Community Cooperative. So Laurel, you know, combines a passion for community engagement, issues of social justice, and also work in local government. Next to her is Professor Dennis Pilon, who has a PhD from York University, and many of you might still recall that Dennis has had been, you know, a member of our department at the University of here at the University of Victoria, and a passionate commentator on BC politics, and in particular a specialist on electoral reform. So we're very glad to have you back, Dennis, here. And last but not least, on your far left, Ben Isett, you know, who has been on Victoria Council now for a number of years, first elected in 2011 and continuing on being twice re-elected. He holds a PhD. He just told me he has a second PhD now in law, so a clear sense of overachievement here. But and a well-published, award-winning author of history books, and also teaching at the University of Victoria, and also a regular commentator in the media. So we have a whole range of expertise, and how I'd suggest we proceed with this first panel is to give each panelist 2 to 3 minutes as an opening statement, reflecting on some of the questions about public deliberation, the role of media and academic expertise, and then we have a little discussion up here, and then give it to you as the audience. We have roughly altogether another 50 minutes by now. So, Tom, the floor is yours, and could I invite you for your opening remarks?
Yeah, so thank you for this introduction and also for the invitation. It's my first time in Victoria, so it's nice to be here. Let me just, a few thoughts. I mean,
The mic's not working.
Or just speak up.
Right, okay. So I'm a historian and I work in and on Eastern Europe. This is a region with quite a few problems when it comes to media and media freedom, also quite a few problems when it comes to academia, and there are currently, in recent years, there's been a deteriorating situation in both areas. Just like to share a few thoughts on the questions already and the problems mentioned in the introduction. Now, I'm a historian, so my initial reflex when I hear about we're encountering something new is to say, well, wait a minute, this is not the first time we've had problems. We've had problems with democracy. This is not the first time we've had encounters with phenomena like disinformation or fake news, as they call them, propaganda. Just remind people of what we had in the Cold War when we were seeing the same kind of phenomena appear. The populism as such is not necessarily a new phenomenon either, but we are seeing kind of mutation. We are seeing a different intensity of these phenomena. Now, just first of all, when it comes to academia, very often we have experts in the media who are not necessarily always from academia. These can be think tankers, sometimes lobbyists. Very often, most political commentators are come from political science. Now, as a historian, and a young historian, I really feel that not only historians, but people from other disciplines should try and engage in the media and in the public debate, because I think we have some expertise to share. There is, of course, this self-critical reflection that we need to move beyond the strict comfort zone of academia and beyond the academy's jargon and know how to communicate these ideas. Maybe as a final thought to move on, if we're looking at what is new, is of course certain technologies that are involved. So for instance, social media. What I also see in the region I live and study in is that while we're maybe focusing on populism, whatever, what I'm seeing is a polarization in societies. I'm seeing social media being an instrument in creating certain echo chambers. When we're talking about public deliberation or democratic deliberation, if, let's say, you have election campaigns, you're on social media. How often do you actually engage with, let's say, the other side or people who you don't agree with? Most often you're in one sort of bubble. And I think this is one of the problems we're encountering with, and that we should kind of think on, like, what would be the ideal space or fora in which we can have this deliberation. And I see a role for both academia and media and journalists, editors, to try and facilitate this kind of let's say, more bridge-building exchange. Because if we don't do that, the polarization will continue, and we might see a deterioration of the phenomena we're seeing today.
Thank you very much, Tom. Laura.
Hi, I thought I would use my reflections or my couple minutes to talk a little bit about kind of the three areas and speak more from my lived experience. First, as an academic, I engaged with the media, especially during the Harper government's Bill C-51. I spoke a lot on radio, I did panels, I spoke to TV outlets, and at the time, my experience with the media was one of kind of easily communicating my message. Especially on the kind of radio shows, often would get interesting dialogue, the opportunity to kind of dig deep into issues and to talk about, to have this kind of democratic debate in what I felt was a meaningful way. shifting into my activism, so this kind of like second area of my world, oftentimes my relationship to the media was being ignored. So we would really try and get attention for issues, whether it was divestment, municipal divestment, trying to move money out of fossil fuel industries into ethical investing, or whether it has to do with climate change. Oftentimes it was such a struggle to get media attention, to have messages be communicated, and really to create the space to have those kind of meaningful democratic debates. Interestingly, I see now a rise of right-wing protest, and I've been noticing the difference that in media attention that it gets. So I was in Ottawa when the convoy went and walked down, looking at some of the messaging around ethical oil, around investing in oil, in building pipelines, but also mixed with a lot of anti-immigrant and xenophobic messaging as well. And the media attention, the kind of public dialogue around it seemed amplified and almost out of proportion to the number of people engaged, and so I've been reflecting a lot on kind of where the media puts its attention, what power the media has in each of those choices, and what a different role can kind of what your positionality really does to give you access to communication. And then the third area is politics, and it's been a steep learning curve since being on council and recognizing the different relationship you have with the media as soon as you are an elected official. And oftentimes it is negotiating sound bites and planning out the snippet of information that will be communicated. Most recently, I was putting forward a motion around the urban forest to invest heavily in the urban forest, and what got communicated was that we were chopping down all the cherry trees. And I'm sure people heard we're cutting them all down. And just to see on this very small scale with this issue that it's important, but on the grand scale of things, potentially not the most important issue. But how quickly misinformation spreads, and how quickly also the public debate gets heated, escalated, and the kind of vitriol and hatred that is then lobbied at people who have differing opinions. And so I kind of paint that picture of these three areas, because it really, depending on where you're located and where you're entering into and where you're encountering the media, it shifts dramatically what you have access to, what change you can make, and also what your experience of the media is. And I'm talking about traditional media, and each one of those areas has a very different relationship to social media as well, with incredibly positive, with many opportunities provided by social media, and at the same time, the downsides that we all know, and especially as a woman in politics, seeing the kind of misogyny, racism, xenophobia that anonymity can allow is also, I think, that we need to be really careful and mindful of, and also start to dig into how do we create compassionate, connected conversations with the people we are in community with, whether it's through traditional media, social media, or in person in these kind of scenarios. So.
Thank you very much, Laura. Dennis.
Great. Well, I want to begin by asking us to think about who the media are concretely that we are talking about, because Oliver sort of introduced us to a kind of ideal type understanding of the media and the media's role, which journalists will put that view forward to you very quickly. But the reality of conventional media in Western societies doesn't match that image. And while Tom is certainly right to draw our attention to countries where the government intervenes directly to control or limit media in Western societies part of the reason that the fake news accusations and the right-wing vitriol land in society is because there is an element of truth in it. that the media do not reflect and represent the societies that they claim to. And the public knows that. It's why they will respond to some of the claims. They'll be directed towards different mobilized groups like the right to go, yeah, media suck. Maybe not for the reasons that the radical right wants them to think so, but they have their own agenda, their own issues that they're unhappy about in terms of the representations that they see in the media. So media bias takes a number of forms. It can encompass who gets included and who gets excluded, what gets talked about, what doesn't. Even when people are included and talked about, the way in which they are framed, positioned in the paper, the emphasis that is put on them, all these things demonstrate a bias. And we know from countless media studies where that bias comes from. It comes from the corporate ownership of media. Right? The corporate ownership of media has a profound impact on the content of media, despite what media will tell you. And we've got all kinds of ways to demonstrate that. So if you want to take that up in the question and answer, we can. But what could we do about it, or what should we do about it? Well, I mean, as someone who studies institutions, frankly, I think that we should publicize, nationalize media. We should bring it into public ownership. We should democratize the media, precisely so that it responds better to the publics that it claims to serve. But I'll tell you, the challenge that we will have there is that the people who don't want democracy in our other institutions don't want our media to be any more democratic either. And so we will face a struggle. And just here in British Columbia in the fall, we saw that struggle in miniature, where incredibly powerful, well-financed sources with fairly bottomless corporate pockets of money were able to promote an agenda of misinformation around the voting system referendum that was held in BC. And the media pretty much stood idly by. And when confronted with facts about the disproportionate amount of coverage of one side against the other, they simply ridiculed those who brought the issues forward and refused to do the job, which of course would be to check whether or not those claims were true. So we have an enormous task ahead of us if improving democratic deliberation is our goal. We have to recognize the enormous odds that are against us in terms of those who are arrayed against us. And in closing this bit, I would just say that the media respond to the needs of deliberation not because it's their ideal type purpose, but because there is a mobilized force within civil society that forces them to do it. And it's precisely because Western media is organized differently than in dictatorships or authoritarian countries that that kind of mobilized opposition can have an impact.
Thanks. Go ahead, Ben.
Thanks. I'd like to thank Rebecca, Oliver, all the members of the committee who've put on tonight's event and both conferences, and also Jason and the venue for hosting. It's a great discussion and a really timely one. I think in the past week we've seen the impacts of fascism on human rights, and it's a timely reminder that that tension between democracy and fascism continues to be a motive force in the world today. And I think the comments of the other speakers, Tom, Laurel, and Dennis, sort of touching on the economic and historical and political dimensions are really important. As a historian, I think it's important to remember that democracy in societies is often shaped by economic factors. And I think we can't sort of move too far away from that question of economic power and how it's concentrated and how it's exercised and what impact that has on the communications system, including the media, and also on the political system. And that tension between whether the society sort of honor and uphold and advance human rights and equality, or whether they privilege hierarchy and sort of existing relationships, is an ongoing tension. And maybe people and our institutions got somewhat complacent in the decades after the Second World War, when it appeared that fascism had been defeated, and it appeared that in Western societies at least an adequate balance had been reached between sort of these forces of fascism and these forces of democracy. But I think keeping in mind that sort of historically contingent nature and the inherent instability of democratic institutions in societies that continue to privilege economic power over human rights. And in our case, capitalist relationships over more egalitarian relationships. Just, I guess, looking at our local democracy and building on some of Laurel's comments, I think what we're seeing, what I've seen on the sort of firsthand from a number of these sort of mini controversies that have swirled around our council, and I think it's fair to say that a majority of our councillors in the city of Victoria have an unwavering commitment to democracy. And that's, I think, a bit of an outlier in terms of other levels of government and other cohorts of elected officials. And I don't think that's just a self-congratulatory comment. It's just knowing my colleagues, I think there's a number of us who really do identify with social movements and identify with grassroots democracy as the preferred model for governing societies, including our own. But we often see, I think, emotion. When we look at how the public's been reacting to some decisions, it's often the debate is driven by emotion rather than informed opinion. And partially, I think this is the diffusion of the media world from consolidated and centralized media organizations to more types of media available with the internet. And also, I think, just a breakdown of sort of discourse and informed opinion as sort of a consequence of neoliberalism and the under-resourcing of institutions that foster critical thinking and engaged and informed citizens. It's also, I think, a symptom of local democracy, not a symptom, but a municipality in British Columbia and in, I believe, in other Canadian provinces, sometimes we function as the executive of our local government. Sometimes we function as the legislative body. Sometimes we function as a judiciary in terms of our land use authority. And all of it happens in the context of open government with very limited recourse to go into closed meetings. And that's a great thing in the sense of the public knowing what their elected officials are doing, but in the context of under-resourced media organizations that are trying to cover it, and there's a phenomenon where basically one reporter will manage to carve out the time to potentially do a somewhat accurate story on something that happened at our city hall. All of the other under-resourced organizations, they're having their daily editorial meeting, trying to come up with stories, and they basically piggyback or snowball onto that initial informed report, but in many cases the subsequent reports are anything but informed. And that's how some offhand remarks from a single councillor relating to cherry blossoms becomes the story of a 2-week media cycle. So I think that's an issue in terms of, with Dennis's comments, the under-resourcing of media organizations can really foster misunderstanding. Something I'd like to say, even though I have huge criticisms of our state broadcaster, I do find in our local media scene, warts and all, neoliberal culture and all, it's often the CBC that is a bit of a glimmer of more accurate and fair reporting in our local media world. So those are some preliminary remarks, and I look forward to the rest of the discussion.
Thank you very much. And I'm really happy my provocation worked. I was the idealist, telling you what, public discourse and media engagement could look like, and you immediately picked up on this one, showing the reality is quite different, right? And, I think pick up from Ben's last comment. We somehow assume that a rational discourse, the availability of a public to listen to the better argument, the informed debate, that these are all things that we can take for granted, in particular in academia. We think that is how the world works. And I think we see across the world, in Europe, in Latin America, and in the US and North America, examples of how this has been an achievement, an historic achievement that is under constant threat. Democracy is not something that we can take as a given, but that is being confirmed and protected and defended by our daily practices. And I think just a reflection, Tom, your reflection on what is happening in Central Eastern Europe, we do see that relatively established liberal democracies can walk back, from certain commitments and could stifle public discourse even to a degree where you have direct state intervention and control, media's independence being questioned. So I think we live in a precarious time in this respect, and us at the university, we depend on very much on an environment in which what we have to say and what we can share finds somewhat of a receptive and and not controlled kind of environment. And we've seen certain tendencies here in Canada as well. We're not entirely protected from this. So that's one theme we could look into. The other one, also, Tom, what you mentioned, how do we speak not only to our own constituency, and that's maybe what media does, the new social media, that we tend not to address those people who think very differently and who might see us as, very far removed from their own value sets and so forth. And it seems that the structure of public discourse at the moment reinforces, these thinking along camps of people, of very distinct groups that get into very nasty fights, and to think about how a more inclusive form of public debate, that would give room and also to the power of the better argument. That's definitely a challenge that we see increasingly. Do you, on the panel, do you want to react to your fellow panelists at the moment, or any direct reaction? You feel sufficiently provoked? Or?
I just wanted to pick up on something that I think both Dennis and Ben put forward, is just this idea of underfunding of media. But I think there's a reciprocal relationship between the underfunding of media and also the underfunding of social services. And when we have an underfunding of social services, and it not only leads to this kind of increased polarization that occurs in our communities, but it also means it can be harder for people to have the time, the energy, the resources to build community, to come together, to fight for democratic ideals, to fight for the things that really matter to them. And that also has this kind of deteriorating effect. And so I think we want to make sure that we are funding public media. We also want to make sure that we're funding public services and social services so that we have the kind of community where people aren't drifting further and further apart, and where they have the time, the resources to be dissidents, which is what we want in our communities. We want people who are committed to civil liberties, who are committed to standing up when our government is making a wrong choice.
We can also, I'm sure you're eager to get into the discussion, to the debate in terms of inclusive debates. So maybe we can already think, unless there is something urgent up here, we have mics that go around, so please speak into them quite clearly, because again, you're recorded, otherwise you can't be picked up online. So who would like to start it off from the audience? In the back there.
No, which is totally fine. It's like, no, why did you invite me? That's not my point. My point is more, is that when I hear things like we should nationalize the media, as lefty as I am, I worry about that sort of slogan. I absolutely get the dominance and the problems with the dominance of corporate control of the media and advertising, the negative influence in terms of bias, but as if the state media doesn't have some inherent bias as well by being part of the state. The BBC, CBC, PBS, anybody who has a different opinion to that centrist institutional status quo perspective doesn't see themselves reflected in those either. So I think what we need is something a little bit more creative than either thinking about the corporate media or the state media. There's lots of other options that journalist unions themselves have been talking about for the last 15 years, such as taxing or placing levies on the major telecommunications companies, which are very, very wealthy, or the Googles of the world, and then using that to fund a household credit that is independent of the state, at arm's length, similar way to the Canada Council for the Arts is funded through the government, but the decisions on the things that are funded are not made by the government themselves. So that's basically what I'd love to see, something a little bit more beyond this binary of either the corporate media or the state media.
Dennis, do you want to directly respond to this?
Well, I mean, I said nationalize the media to, offer up a provocative image, that people could relate to. But there are many different ways, as you say, to essentially democratize the media. That's really, I think, the objective. And, and we don't have to make it all up. There's plenty of examples in other areas of the world where they have taken these sorts of political approaches. They had readership subsidies throughout Western Europe for newspapers that couldn't gain corporate sponsorship. In other words, newspapers that chose to cover news in a way that was not seen as amenable to corporate advertising, but they could demonstrate that they had readership, could get subsidies from the state. So there are all different ways in which we could do this. And my bias, of course, is to make it as democratic as possible. What we do find in countries that use proportional voting systems where no one party has control over government at one time is that they do tend to have media policies that are more proportional as well, which means that they're more inclusive, more representative, and less subject to the pressures that you've named. The countries that you named all use first-past-the-post voting systems that allow usually one party to control everything and everybody else to be shut out. Having said that, the BBC had a policy of proportional representation of different kinds of cultural representations, and that's why you saw a lot more working-class dramas and sitcoms on the BBC than you did on American television or Canadian television. So there are some interesting wrinkles there.
Just want to pick up on that comment about the BBC, because in the run-up to the Brexit vote, one of the big critiques of the BBC was that they just put all opinions out there, leading to various false equivalencies. Journalists were not doing their job, were not calling out, and they sometimes still are not doing this when certain politicians from one camp are blatantly propagating lies or spreading misinformation. Journalists are not calling them out on it, and in this sense, I mean, even that kind of pluralistic approach apparently fails to reach its target.
Just a quick response, Tom. The reason why is because, same in Canada, right? People complain about the CBC, and part of the reason that CBC doesn't act the way that other public broadcasters do is because it's always looking to where its budget's going to get cut. And so what we've seen is the CBC move in more and more of a neoliberal direction, hoping that somehow they will get in the good books of the conservatives and liberals and somehow avoid the cuts that are coming. It never works, but nonetheless they continue to do it. The funding arrangements in countries with proportional voting in the Western sphere anyway, Western Europe, don't suffer from quite the same problems. So, I mean, yeah, there's interesting nuances to the argument.
Okay, thank you for all the really interesting points. And I want to mention a couple of things. First of all, I do know that there are some journalists and radio talk show hosts in this city that have been pressured by the corporate advertisers to actually not cover certain topics and have been somewhat threatened. You can't talk about this, you can't talk about that. So there's one aspect of the corporate media that is based on the financing of advertising that I think is really insidious and quite dangerous. So I worry about that. But I also wanted to focus a little bit on us as consumers of media. I feel like we all are people who receive media, and talk a little bit or think a little bit from the panel about how we do that, how we are consumers. Because it seems to me, I've always considered myself to be fairly media literate because I actually really enjoy media and exploring. And we're lucky because we have more choices of where to go and how to do it. However, a lot of times the way I see it is that media knows that they're getting ratings if a story is sensational. If a story is based on fear, if a story is kind of gossipy, if a story is based on a tiny little bit of truth, like you mentioned earlier, but then blown up into hyperbole. I see so many examples of that. So I kind of wonder about myself as a consumer of media. Where should I actually boycott, turn it off, really help promote some alternative media sources that are probably closer to how I think and feel, and why it is sometimes that I get attracted to the sensationalism, because honestly, I do sometimes. Hate to admit it, but it's awful. So just I guess my question is two-part, looking at corporate advertising and how it influences the people that want to speak truth and can't, and how we as consumers are really affected by sensationalism, fear, and so on. Thank you.
Thank you. Could I just add one element here? At the university, I think we are at a very similar spot to say, how do you find reliable information? How do you deal with the overwhelming amount of information now? And the literacy when it comes to dealing with media has become a major challenge. Maybe just an anecdote. I spoke to someone who teaches at Pearson College, which is one of the very high level, very prestigious institution teaching 18, 19-year-olds. And he said basically his group of students fall into two camps. One that uses information in a way, the old way, critically and also for political engagement. And the other half, he's basically said, they say, whatever you say, I find the opposite on the internet. All media are fake. There's nothing reliable. There is no real information out there. And that's, in a way, the degree to which media discourse has been undermined for sometimes very good reasons. The critique of media being biased is, as long as we have media, for good reason as well. But I think we are at a critical point now in terms of how do we actually use the information that is being conveyed through these kind of challenge, and how do we give, in particular, younger people the tools to deal with this, right? And I think that's a real challenge that has political implications.
Can I just ask that you bring the mics closer to your mouth so that people live streaming can hear us?
Okay.
Thanks for the question, Heather. I think ultimately people's power is as engaged citizens and activists and taking an active role in shaping communities, and we have limited power as consumers. I think it's sort of a more utopian approach. If everyone in this room and our friends and anyone else who's engaged sort of opted out or gravitated to more perfect or ideal media platforms, that would still leave everyone else consuming the corporate media materials, which are sort of gravitating or lurching in quasi or overtly fascist direction. So I don't think that, but in terms of as individuals to get by each day, I think we consume what we need to be informed and participate in our democracy, and then it's pretty much whatever. So I read The Guardian, and that's actually the only media I enjoy reading. And then I skim the local headlines to know how they're covering what's going on locally. And generally I just opt out. I'll go for a walk down to the beach and live in the real world and get off the media as much as I can. As citizens, there's an analogy there that it's really the unmediated communications where we have the greatest impact. The reason we have a progressive city council is because of the face-to-face and one-on-one communications with a number of people in this room who knocked on doors for 2 months straight, had tens of thousands of conversations, and engaged in the battle of ideas that way, in an unmediated way. And we basically did an end run around the corporate media. And so it's face-to-face meetings like this one, it's conversations on the doorstep, it's handing out leaflets or having a petition on a street corner. That's the cornerstone of democracy. And that's how we defeat or we thwart the harmful impacts of capitalist media organizations.
We take this as a sign of support, I'm not sure, unless there's anyone, please.
Hi, I'm from Ontario, and I taught in the high schools where I taught media literacy, and Mike Harris got rid of it, but I think it's really important that everybody knows, and so you start at a level where everybody understands that media is constructed, and then you learn all the terms. So bringing it back, it would be nice in Ontario. I won't even go to Ontario right now, but in BC, it's something that we can do and put it into the curriculum, and I think it's really works. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, we have a question online from Patrick, who asks, in the age of fake news, what does the panel think about objective reporting and truthful coverage of issues that are of interest to communities? and I think the panel will mostly be pro-objective and pro-truth. So if I can spin that a bit, I think we've addressed a bit how there's almost a two-track consumption. We watch national media, we read international media, we're online, and there's a lot of the same conversations. There's a lot of the same stories, and the local coverage is either underfunded or very minimal. So there's a kind of disconnect there. And I take part of the question to be maybe how do we cultivate coverage of local issues in a more in-depth way?
Maybe I'll take a stab at, you know, I don't know if I have a real answer to the question, but it kind of, something in it tied to what Heather, you were talking about hyperbole, and I noticed for myself personally on council when an issue has come up, the councillors who speak in hyperbole, who speak in this kind of you know, over the top, exaggeration, leaning towards bending what's actually happening, often will get picked up. And so I have started, when I'm looking through my council agenda for the week and I'm writing out my thoughts and comments, started to think, okay, where can I use hyperbole in a way that will get media attention to this issue in the way that I want, that will spark the conversation. And so there's and I will never use, you know, falsehoods, but I am looking at how do I create a one-liner or something that will grab attention enough to cover this important issue and get it into the paper in the way that I need the community to know about it. And so I think there's an obligation for us as politicians on how we're communicating. There's an obligation for journalists on what they're covering, and ideally, we engage with journalists and in this conversation as well. So I thank the journalists in the back for bringing up that point. And then also as citizens, I want our citizens to really be looking at these local stories. And sometimes the headlines are actually very different than the chunk of the story that covers. So this kind of, and I've been guilty of it too, just reading a headline and sharing something, or to really start taking that media responsibility seriously.
We go to the back.
Hello. I'm interested because it hasn't been part of the conversation so far about the new media concentration and consolidation. I've been a student of critical media studies for almost 2 decades now, Curran, Herman, Chomsky, but none of them were working in a world of FANGs, of the Facebooks, Alphabets, Netflix, etc., Twitter. And so many of the journalists that people are reading today have their own discourse on Twitter that decides what the terms of the discourse are going to be. And there's something that's problematic that's arising, which is the concept of deplatforming, somebody who's controversial, somebody who says something that's outside of the bounds of civil discourse can get totally thrown out of this important media arena that is now shaping the discourse that the newspapers and the television channels are picking up on. A line that I heard recently is, first they came for the anti-vaxxers, then they went for Alex Jones, but I'm not sure if people are aware, but trans activists are actually being deplatformed. And in a recent YouTube policy decision, they said that people who question the historic events of 9/11 are being deplatformed. So I'm interested to hear the panel's opinion or concerns about the new media that's arising, how it's influencing debate, and the significance of censorship in this new age of information technology in a global public sphere.
You definitely set the bar very high here, you know, to cover something that's quite complex. But who wants to take a stab at this? I'm not looking at you, Dennis. Now, okay.
Well, I mean, you know, deplatforming was the norm. I mean, the recent opening up of space through these alternate channels is the novelty. You know, if you go back and look at BC media over the 20th century, particularly in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, you will struggle to find a column inch that is positive towards the left, despite the fact that millions of people voted for a left-wing party. I mean, it's quite remarkable that that party got any votes, given the lack of balanced coverage. So, let's not romanticize a past that somehow people were smarter or better informed or where the media did their job, because that never existed. But in terms of the deplatforming issue now, we come back to these issues about democracy. That how can we democratize? Because ultimately, the promise of these new platforms is always affected by the material inequalities that exist within the society. Part of the alt-right success is not just because of YouTube and the internet, it's the Koch brothers' millions of dollars that they have funneled to these groups and these various organizations that allowed them to have the material resources to be online all the time. I mean, why are those comment sections in the newspapers so crazy right-wing? It's because there's a huge bunch of old white men who've got nothing better to do but sit there and type out comments. The rest of us are busy. So we have to try to, often I think we want to get drawn into what is it about the technology, what is it about the novelty, what is it about the way we're talking about it, and often I get drawn back to the material side of the question. Who has resources to organize themselves to be able to participate in these spaces, not just once, but over and over and over again? Because any of you who've studied media analysis know that the key to media success, or the key to messaging in politics, is to repeat your message again and again and again. Not because people necessarily believe it. That's a great myth. People are buying all this stuff. What it does is it controls the agenda. It controls what people think other people think. And people act on what they think other people think. I don't want to be the only person who supports this. I guess nobody's for this. I'm not going to say anything. But if people start to think that maybe other people also think this thing, then they're more willing to say that they too also support those things. So we come back to some of these, I think, material questions.
We have 8 minutes left for this segment. Maybe we collect now 3 questions that I see in the room and then come back for a last round here. Otherwise, we might run out of time very quickly. So please, to the back.
Thank you. I have a fair amount of experience with the press. Not much of it good, except in the U.S., where I was featured on ABC and PAX TV for work in prevention of violence in the schools and things like that. And John Stuart Mill wrote, it's not the violent conflict of the truth, it's the quiet suppression of half of it that's the formidable evil. And what's happened to me is this thing has steamrolled and got bigger and bigger and bigger until finally I was hauled in to face the judge, and I got 5 years in prison because of what the press portrayed as my humanitarian businesses in a whole different light. Now, I've run that gauntlet, but I'm not pro-inmate or pro-authorities, but I did have to live with these people. And they've touched a hot stove, and they don't want to touch a hot stove again, but the press buries them. They put a target on their back when they get out. They can't move. They can't breathe. And so my question is, how does and I like, I think what you said there about going around the press with leaflets and stuff. But how do you get the media to stop and get the full story? Like, the story about me in the press didn't say anything that I was acting on legal advice. It didn't say anything about the 9,013 pages of source code I wrote. It had none of the good stuff about what I did. It just vilified and demonized me to the point where, and there's some cover-up issues. There's other issues there. But the real issue with the press is the media started in 1999 on me, and they haven't let up, despite the fact that I donated $600,000 to charity. I did all that kind of stuff.
I think your question came through quite clear.
Okay,
to power. Thank you, Jamie.
Thanks. I'd like to ask if there's any wisdom about what I think might be a coming trend, which is the stuff that's been coming out of Ontario, for example, arguing that in the name of free speech, certain spaces that are deemed to be too contaminated by one side of a particular set of issues need to be opened up, usually more to the right side of the spectrum than they've been so far. And it occurs to me that in a small way it has some parallels with a wide range of disadvantaged groups who in the past have said we need spaces where we can talk to ourselves, where we really need those echo chambers for a while to get our position together. And so I think what's said about the universities in Ontario's case might threaten a number of other attempts to try to set up safe spaces for speech. How do we respond to those things effectively, knowing that that itself has to be debated in the public media?
And one last question, was in the front here. Nope.
Thanks. So this was just a very limited point about social media. What difference would it make if everybody had to do things under their own name?
All right, we have, maybe we start with you, Ben, and then work our way this way, if you could be relatively concise. All right.
The first, they're very distinct questions, an important one. The first one, I think the antidote to the corporate media and its biases, I think, is greater democratization of the media in terms of various forms of subsidization, either from transferring from existing media organizations or just from general revenue to nonprofit, cooperative, and state media. Essentially media organizations that are organized around something other than the profit motive. And I think when you do have more actors in the media world who aren't beholden to advertisers and profit considerations, that can have a positive impact in improving the quality of reporting coming even from the capitalist media organizations and sort of reviving that standard of fairness and accuracy in reporting. In terms of the question about the threat on academic freedom in the post-secondary sector, I think upholding the principles of affirmative action and pluralism, and that it's okay to have right-wing professors, it's okay to have Marxist professors, it's okay for students to be able to make the choice about where they enroll. It's okay for scholars to pursue research as they see fit. And I think when that commentary begins to pick up steam, there's a real risk that it will stifle the progressive critical voices. And then on the last question, I think removing anonymity in social media would have a lot of value. To follow up on that one question earlier, I think these oligopolies in social media platforms is troubling. Facebook, Twitter, we have anything but a democratic global platform for people engaging in social media conversations, which goes back to the issue of unmediated communications and activism and organizing in the real world.
Just on the last question, I think the research supports the view that if people have to put their own names, they tend to behave differently. And when people don't have to, then their sense of accountability is much, much lower.
And maybe I'll just speak to the first question. I do think that there is a value in having media training and having media strategists. And so for those of us who don't have the funds to hire a communications team to help us in those, dealing with crises in the media, having community that will provide the kind of training, especially if people are going into politics or going into activism, to have media training in your community that is resourced and where we can mentor the people who are coming after us as well, I think is a key part of that.
I'll just finish off with one thought, picking up what I said in the beginning, and because I haven't heard it here. Just reflecting on my own experience working with some media outlets and with journalists, and we've mentioned social media. I want to say, well, a lot of phenomena are not really new. These problems have existed in the past. There are certain solutions, but I haven't heard anything, for instance, about like when we're on social media. A lot of people get their news from media outlets through social media. Now, there is this thing about algorithms, right? I think it was last year, early last year, some of the media outlets I worked with, that Facebook changed its algorithms, pushing out media that I was regularly reading out of my newsfeed. And this is perhaps, and when we're talking about deplatforming certain people, let's say, okay, the example of Alex Jones was mentioned. Is he a news source? I don't think so. Algorithms, these things should perhaps be regulated, because how else would you get other alternative media? I mean, here are the big corporations that can pay for ads and whatever. I mean, they're at a very big disadvantage, aren't they? So perhaps this is something for politicians also to think about, because this is something politicians can do, and they can perhaps introduce some regulation in that area.
Thank you very much. Please join me in thanking our panelists for a wonderful discussion. And staying with the theme, we have switched panels now, staying with the theme of being critical about corporations. There won't be a commercial break now, but we do something else. And Rebecca Nellums is going to introduce a short video clip that we use during the time that we switch people up here on stage and move into the second panel. So, Rebecca, do you want to come?
So we're going to be showing a short video clip, about 8 minutes long, from a longer webinar that was held last Friday, which is available online, the Center for Global Studies. And it's a conversation between Jim Tully, who we have the honor of having here tonight, and Boaventura de Sousa Santos. So Jim Tully is an emeritus professor of political science, law, indigenous governance, and philosophy. He's fellow of the Royal Society of Canada, emeritus fellow of the Trudeau Foundation. He's published 11 authored and edited volumes and over 90 chapters and articles, among them Strange Multiplicity, Public Philosophy in a New Key, On Global Citizenship, and Resurgence and Reconciliation. Jim specializes in public philosophy, freedom, constitutionalism, nonviolence, civic engagement, and indigenous settler relations. Boaventura de Sousa Santos is a professor of sociology in the University of Coimbra in Portugal and distinguished legal scholar at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. He's director at the Center for Social Studies at the University of Coimbra and has written and published widely on the issues of globalization, sociology of law, and the state, epistemology, social movements, and the World Social Forum. So hope you enjoy the clip, and I invite you to, at some point, take in the entire webinar, which is a really rich, longer conversation. And then we'll be up with our second panel after the video.
We are in a crisis, and this crisis, because this globalization was led by the United States and was based on a technological innovation, which was the laptop, the cell phone, and everything. We are on the verge of a new globalization, which is artificial intelligence, automation, and robotics. And it looks like that China is better positioned to lead this globalization. So we are now facing a terrible, violent rivalry between the United States and China. And when this rivalry increases, as at the beginning of the 20th century, we had 2 world wars in Europe. And now you cannot understand what's happening in Brazil. You cannot understand what's happening in Venezuela, except for this rivalry, because what the United States wants is the oil of Venezuela as the oil of Brazil, which is much closer to the United States than the oil in the Middle East, which is closer to China. So, and this rivalry is leading these undemocratic processes all over the place. And you can see, even in Europe, how the extreme right, how Brexit was produced by fake news. And now the United Kingdom doesn't know what to do with this monster. A monster created democratically in a referendum of participatory democracy, but of course manipulated by fake news. So I think that it is with these two ideas, one foot in the system. Why one foot? Because they are not outright dictatorships. So they have some formal aspects of democracy, some countries more than others. Of course, your country more than Brazil. My country now, which is the only country run by a leftist government in Europe, a socialist plus communists and leftist bloc, but it's kind of an exception. The world is moving in this sea of undemocratic forces undermining democracy. So I think that I don't agree with this David Runciman and other pessimists that say things like that, democracy was at a beginning and will have an end, and therefore maybe the end of democracy. I don't believe that, because they never asked this question, which for me is crucial. Capitalism started by not existing. It's not there forever, cannot be there forever. It's not there since the beginning of the world, and there is no need to think there will be no world beyond capitalism. I think that democracy will change, and probably will change to be a more encompassing type of structure, or then we'll live in a dystopia of little feudal castles and a chaotic field of battles and violent lives conducted by under people, subhuman people, which is after all the recipe of the modernity in which humanity cannot be fulfilled. And my last note, Jim, is that as you and me, as activists also, we cannot afford to be outright pessimists. In my case, I'm a Spinozian, and for Spinoza, you have two affects, fear and hope. And one needs the other. And of course, hope without fear is terrible, but fear without hope is also terrible. Most people in the world today are fearful and have no hope. And a few have only hope. I think that we have to instill fear into the only hopeful ones and instill freedom, hope, and give hope to those that are just fearful. So this is our task as public scholars and also as activists. And it's such a pleasure to have the occasion to discuss this with you.
Well, that was simply wonderful. There was so much in that. I think we should turn to the audience fairly quickly, because I'm sure people have lots of good questions. But I just want to add something. I too agree with one foot in the representative institutions. You can't just abandon them. And the other foot in community-based participatory practices of democracy. And I call this joining hands between two quite distinct types of citizenship. I call that civic when it's community-based and participatory, and civil when it's in the representative institutions. And it seems to me, both from what you've said and my own thinking, is that there are two coordination problems here. One, coordination amongst your demo democracies around the world. The World Social Forum tried to be a place where people could get together and share ideas and so on. So that's one coordination problem. There are so many people doing things around the world, but it's not very well connected. But then the second coordination problem is coordinating the relationship between participatory Democrats like 15M in Spain and representative movements like Podemos. That's a real challenge. And we have Dr. Pablo Osil here, who's working in this area, as you know, you've met him. But so there's a kind of double coordination problem. If we could solve that, we would be on our way to creating a permaculture of sustainable democratic practices around the planet that would be resilient enough to survive this clash that we see between China and the United States over the few natural resources that are haven't been already destroyed. And what we need now is resiliency in these counter practices or counter institutions. And I want to say that I think we have to turn to Gandhi here, both for his nonviolence, but also for his mantra, really. Gandhi's mantra was non-cooperation with systems of injustice, and then turn and cooperate with alternative institutions that are sustainable and are just and are self-organized. And we've got to think always now in this two ways. How do we non-cooperate with these self-destructive systems that we've got ourselves caught up in, withdraw our producing and consuming capabilities from them, and then find ways to insert them into sustainable practices and gradually build up these practices until we reach various kinds of tipping points. It may look like it's way too slow of a process, but I think if we keep a foot in each, in the representative institutions and in the communities of democratic practice, we can build up resilient Homo sapien societies that could survive the unsustainable drift of the dominant institutions.
Again, the full version of that webinar will be on the CFGS website. So I really encourage you to listen to the full, rich conversation. Welcome to the second panel of the evening. My name is Rebecca Nellams. I'm a graduate fellow at the Center for Global Studies. And before introducing our panelists, I just want to again acknowledge that we're on the most beautiful and unceded territories of the Lekwungen-speaking peoples of the Esquimalt and Songhees nations. And I want to make that acknowledgement as we're all guests here on this stage, on this land, and also as we're turning to talking about different democratic traditions. I want to acknowledge the distinctive democratic traditions of the Lekwungen-speaking peoples that they've been practicing for thousands of years and continue to practice right here. I'm so honored to get to be up on the stage with the three of you tonight. David Owen, to my right here, is a professor of social and political philosophy at the University of Southampton. His research ranges widely across contemporary political philosophy and the history of political thought. Two of David's primary interests are problems of political community, especially migration and democratic theory and practice. David is co-editor of the Critical Powers book series for Manchester University Press and Citizenship's Transitions for Palgrave Macmillan. And amongst his numerous publications is his co-authored book entitled Prospects for Citizenship, his book Nietzsche's Genealogy of Morality, and two co-edited volumes, Multiculturalism and Political Theory, and Recognition and Power. Thank you for being here tonight. Antje Wiener is a professor of political science, especially global governance, at the University of Hamburg, and a Bye Fellow at Hughes Hall University of Cambridge. She is an international relations theorist with a central interest in norm contestation. She's been a fellow of the Academy of Social Sciences in the United Kingdom since 2011, and together with Jim Tully is co-founding editor of the interdisciplinary journal Global Constitutionalism. Antje has held chairs in international studies at Queen's University Belfast and the University of Bath, and has taught at Stanford and Carleton universities, and was co-founding associate editor of the European Political Science Review. She has numerous books and journal publications, a recent example of which includes her book Contestation and Constitution of Norms in Global International Relations, published by Cambridge University Press last year. Pablo Uthiel is a postdoctoral fellow at the University of Victoria in political science, working with Jim Tully. His research interests include public philosophy, collective presences, horizontality, nonviolence, and civic democracy. By standing within the tradition of public philosophy, the core of his work is centered on excavating networks of individuals governing themselves in numerous ways that supersede our current structures of representative government. Pablo's work on the 15M movement is forthcoming in his book, Democracy Here and Now, The Exemplary Case of Spain, which is being published by U of T Press. Pablo is also a founding member of the Cedar Tree Institute at the Center for Global Studies and has played a key role in both envisioning and bringing to life the Democracies and Its Futures conference. This is the start of this week. So thank you for all being here tonight. Earlier in the conversation in the webinar, Boa makes the chilling remark, as one of our participants noticed, that democracy is dying democratically. Pablo, I wanted to start with you, picking up on Jim's comments about your work in the 15M movement, and what insights that you've gained from this research that you've been doing about the idea of having one foot inside the system, one foot outside the system, and this concept of joining hands. And also, I'm curious about where you situate the 15M movement within the broader wave of Occupy movements in 2011 that it was connected to.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, everybody. And that was a very generous comment by Jim, by the way. He's always just had to put that there. Well, to be honest, 15M changed the way I was. It changed the way I learned about movements because you know, being in the university, you're given these theories, and then you go and look at, or at least how I was being trained before, you go and look at the movements and you try and fit these theories into the movements. But the first thing that the 15M people were telling you is that they didn't want any form of representation. They didn't feel represented. They didn't feel like the experts in the media or the politicians or the bankers were doing anything for them. So they actually set out to begin a conversation. So I think the first thing I've learned from 15M is the importance of getting with each other so we can talk to each other and with each other. Because there is a fundamentally different experience that happens when we are sitting here, for example, in this situation where there's some expert or expertise telling you what is going on, to actually sitting with somebody else and generating knowledge together. So for me, 15M, I mean, we can talk about the specifics of what happened in that country, but I think what's useful at this moment is how is it like that? Is that okay? How is 15M affecting the way I engage here at the University of Victoria? And what it's really doing for me is that it's altered the way I think teaching should take place. So we are in a space in the university where fundamentally there's a lot of expertise with wonderful academics, but students are sitting there and almost absorbing this knowledge. Whereas especially with Keith Sherry, who's co-teaching a course with me, what we're really trying to do is make sure that the knowledge is learned with the students and co-generated with the students. And I think that is the fundamental lesson that I've learned with 15M. If we want to change the societies we're in, if we want to have democratic societies, we need to engage in dialogues that become transformative in the very enactment of the dialogue.
David, maybe we could move to you now with this question of joining hands and thinking of a comment you made earlier about how democracy, as we've noted, has always been party democracy, but that has been running its course. So what are your thoughts about what might joining hands look like from beyond the state?
Okay, so in terms of the first question, the question about party democracy, I mean, if we kind of track the formation of democracy in Europe and the New World and then around the world, was based on mass political parties. Okay, we no longer meaningfully have mass political parties. We have parties that are primarily agents of governance rather than agents of representation. We've seen partisan de-alignment for 60 years. Now we've seen increased voter volatility. Through the kind of 80s and 90s, we essentially had government by cartel, where there was very little difference between parties, and it was minor managerial shifts. The 24-hour news cycle reinforced a kind of discipline, centralizing discipline on parties. But the problem here is that we don't actually have anything else. So the question, and this is very much raised by Pablo's work and Angie's work and Jim's, is okay, what can we do to kind of reshape representative institutions in ways that either reinvigorate the party structure in some new way, or which move beyond, as it were, the sort of party democracy that we have had and we have been used to, and we still in a kind of zombie-like way run on with, okay? I mean, this is what the late Peter Mayer called the hollowing out of democracy. Parties used to mediate between society and state. They were what reconciled popular democracy and constitutional democracy. They were a space of political education where people, as it were, got to understand how the activity of politics works. That's kind of important because one of the things we see, and this goes back to the previous panel talking about polarization, is that people no longer have political experience. There's been a kind of political de-skilling of populations, which leads to an easy moralism. You know, you're either on my side or you're evil. You know, now the left has always had a sort of tendency to slip into moralism, but we see exactly the same thing on the right. You know, the British Conservative Party used to be basically a pragmatist party, will do whatever it takes to get into power. Now it's a highly moralized, highly ideological party, and hence, you know, Brexit, internal divisions, and the rest of it. That's not a pragmatist party anymore. So one key question here for the future of our democracies is how do we form democratic systems that sustain what's valuable about democracies without mass political parties in the sense in which we used to have them? Okay, so how does that then connect to democracy beyond the state? Well, one of the reasons we've seen for the decline of parties is tied into a set of broader changes in global economic and political structures. We've seen increased pluralization of communities, leading to sort of all the multicultural debates. We see ongoing levels of migration, but we've also seen changes in terms of tax competition between states, changes in employment structures, what's often captured under the catchphrase of neoliberalism. You know, and those things all affect democracy within the state, but the state itself may have very little capacity to fundamentally challenge some of these things because it's embedded in a wider set of global changes. So the question of what can you expect from the state, what are the capacities of states for transforming their internal societies under those global conditions is a second really critical point for us, and one that means that if you're going to be concerned with democracy, you can't just be concerned with democracy in your state anymore. You have to be concerned with democracy globally. So just to end the remarks, Canada scores really highly on Democracy Index. I think it's about 6th in the world on the Democracy Index, which is a purely internal measure. If we look at Canada in terms of is Canada a global force for democracy, the picture is much less positive. Canada is ranked actually 17th out of the 27 richest states in the world. It's not terrible, okay? But it's not particularly good, and there are a number of ways in which Canada is very weak. So, for example, the percentage of its gross national income that it gives in development aid is 0.26 against the international norm target, which some states have already achieved, of 0.7. Okay, so for all of us, and that includes Brits like me who are going through a national nervous breakdown at the at the moment, the question has to be, what are kind of global conditions of sustainable democracy? And that's really the sort of challenge of transnational civic activism, as well as greater civil cooperation between, as it were, particularly democratic states that we have to face up to.
Thank you. This leads really well into your work, I think, Antje. And you talk a lot about some of the challenges and the absurdities that one encounters when contesting and challenging the state in different institutions, as well as different practices that you see moving forward as hopeful ways to address these issues, some of these issues.
Yeah, well, I can pick up from the coordination problems that Jim mentions between the representative and the local practice and the civil and the civic, and it's all about finding bridges and constructing pathways between the different places. And this brings with it, and there I can relate to both David and Pablo, new forms of agency. I may mention, I mean, I'm coming from international relations, so I always have the sort of the broader view, and the danger is to think in a top-down way, and to think about how norms are implemented locally, and to many of my colleagues are beginning to believe in the achievement of, if you apply as many liberal norms as possible, if you implement them in faraway places, then the world becomes a better place. But of course that's not the case, because the norm lies in the practice, and practices are very important. And the question then is, whose practices count when we actually attach meaning to the core norms of supposedly democracy, like human rights, the rule of law, and so on. And I'll give you an example when we talk about about torture prohibition, for example. What I found in my research there, which looked at strategic litigation networks that were interdisciplinary and that were moving along normative structures that were crisscrossing around the globe, and which came to the result in their political work that they no longer said that a victory in court means more justice. Now think about that. If you think about the rule of law, and people think we need more justice, we need more access to the law, but maybe international law is not sort of the place or the mechanism which enhances democracy. So what they actually found was that documenting detail about the atrocities was much more important to counter the culture of impunity globally. So that raises all kinds of new questions about what is universal jurisdiction. And I found the same when I looked at the case of the prohibition of violence against women and girls during wartime. Again, a huge culture of impunity, which started with silencing women and girls to not talk about the atrocities. And that we can go back to the Nuremberg trials, where people said, oh, let's not get into the details of the atrocities. But it's exactly the details that we need to hear in order to then find ways of working on them. And I come back to the point that I made in the first sentence, that we need to build bridges and pathways in order to substantiate and to identify the meanings of these central norms of liberal democracy that people claim so highly. And here the solution, or one of the points of building pathways and bridges, is to include those who are affected by the atrocities in the solution of the problem. And this comes back to my question, whose norms count, whose practices count, and whose practices ought to count. And there my argument is, I'm very fond of contestation. I think you have to have the possibility of contesting injustices, and that cannot stop at the point of objection to something, which is reactive, but it must involve proactive critical engagement with something, and that's enabling. And I stop there for now.
I'm sure there's lots of questions in the audience, so I'm just going to throw out one more question for all of you before going to the online and in-person audiences. So I just want to pick up on the point that Boa made around the need for both hope and fear, and that there's a role for academics in that. And I'm curious what all of your thoughts are about that, especially in this age of where the right-wing populist white supremacist movements have been really mobilizing around rhetorics of fear. So I'm curious about what you see as the role of academics in this area. We can jump in conversationally, whatever order you like. Yeah.
Well, I think that, thank you for that question. I think it's a very important question. I think that as learned scholars, academics have a responsibility to share that knowledge, not in terms of missionaries to make people follow what they say, but to enable others. And so we have the possibility to maybe connect certain thoughts, like coming up with naming problems for what they are, like the coordination problem, and being able to draw on principles that are out there, and then enabling our students to maybe change the way we see the world. I mean, for me, in international relations theory, we started not to teach the canon of how the discipline has been taught for, I don't know, the past 50, 60, 100 years in the United States. But we start thinking about the discipline as something that is a global discipline. International relations evolve from various places, so students are encouraged to come up with their view of the world from different areas and to fill in the gaps rather than repeating the errors that have been made. And I conclude with one of the major sort of errors that are taught in all 101 classes, that there is such a thing as the Treaty of Westphalia that created the Westphalian states. Don't write that in your exams. It's utter nonsense.
I'll go. Well, I think that when I look at the university right now, I think one of the biggest challenges we have is the way that knowledge is being produced in the university. If you really spend time in there, you realize that students are being trained to publish in particular kinds of journals, publish at a particular speed, and I think that the biggest responsibility that we should assume as citizens who happen to be in the university is to make sure that we are very careful about making sure we don't just generate knowledge for the sake of securing grants, for the sake of staying in the university, because we are actually witnessing the hollowing out of the university. I mean, we talk about the hollowing out of democracy, we talk about the problems with the media, but right now we have a university system that is, I think, on life support, and I would really encourage everybody to think very seriously about that. So that would be my response to the responsibility of academics. Now, in regards to the idea of fear and hope, what came to mind when I heard Boa talk about that was something that it took me back to the square occupations of 15M in Spain, and the fact that what I was witnessing there was a kind of collectively generated hope, or an auto-generated hope, if you like. It was that the actual practices were giving people hope that something could change, and I think that that's something that we again need to pay very serious attention to. If we get depressed with what's going on out there, start mobilizing. That's something that Howard Zinn used to say, you know, it's really depressing out there, you know, two of you go somewhere, start mobilizing, you know, and then we will be hopeful. Because, I mean, look at our societies today. We're facing, you know, nuclear threats. We're facing, we're observing countries being invaded. We're observing governments being toppled. And there's absolutely little, well, it doesn't seem to be like we have a mainstream acknowledgement of the problems with war. We're talking about democracy, but no one talked about imperial wars, right? David did, you know, he mentioned that we're measuring the democracy inside. So I think hope will come from, you know, mobilizing together and actually trying to really address those problems together.
Okay, any sports fan will tell you that it's hope that kills you. And that's true in politics too. It's the hope that kills you. So I kind of put less stress on hope. What I put a lot of stress on is showing that fears are illusory. So it's less a question being fearful and more a question for me of showing or trying to help people see that things that they're fearful of are not things that they need to be fearful of. So a lot of the sort of, populist narratives, and this goes back to the political de-skilling point, are very simplifying narratives. And they can be comforting in that way because the world is really pretty complicated and difficult. So a nice story which makes it all black and white and promises simple solutions, which never appear as and when populists get into power, suddenly life becomes more difficult. Those things we need to contest. And we need to show that the sort of fearful framing of, all the Muslim immigrants coming to Europe, as one of our more hysterical commentators in Britain, that it's an existential crisis for European civilization. Well, sorry, I'm not allowed to swear, Mike, because we're live streaming.
That wasn't my rule.
Nonsense, shall we say? Nonsense. It's not an existential challenge. I mean, sorry, I find it difficult to control my language at these moments. There are, things to worry about. There are genuine concerns. There are things that we should feel properly fearful of. But a lot of what we're told we should be fearful of, we have no reason to fear. And I think a central part of the academics' role is to try and, show people the illusoriness of many of the fears that they are being fed.
Thank you all for that. So I'd like to turn now to the audience here in person for any questions you have for any of the panelists or all three. Or online, okay.
System of education.
Okay, yeah, this has actually come up quite a lot recently in sort of more technical academic work as well as in public thing. So are the public just too stupid for democracy, basically? So should we have a kind of epistocratic system whereby you have to pass a political test to have a vote? Or should we have something like John Stuart Mill, who was mentioned earlier, plural voting system, so we give people more votes depending on how academically qualified or otherwise showing that they have knowledge and experience. And I think, the basic argument against these things is that all the solutions are worse than the problem. Okay? So it may well be that there are a lot of people voting in ways that are not as informed as we might like, that are kind of using cues and shortcuts and stuff in ways that encode biases. But the response to that is not to say, okay, well, take you out of the voting. Okay? The response is to say, right, how do we better educate ourselves, all of us, politically? How do, and this goes actually back to issues that Laurel was raising in the first panel about how do we kind of do political education in local communities. And civic participation is crucial for political education. So how do we create kind of infrastructures of political reskilling? But, the specific response to the question is all the solutions are worse.
Any other thoughts to add, or should we?
Well, maybe. I mean, I wouldn't necessarily bank on just bank on education. As I said, I mean, I focus on the practice and the practice of contestation and before joining academia, I've been pretty active in social movements in Europe and in Mexico, and what I found was most of the time people are pretty good in organizing locally, and they come up with their own strategies, and usually, in my experience, a movement is doomed the moment they start voting. Voting is really the last resort, and a good practice is not about voting. And I mean, we have now the oldest democracies in the world, and they stumble over their voting practices, and they don't even know the rules according to which they vote, nonetheless, or not least to say what they vote about. But the point here is really, of course, there is a necessity of access to knowledge. But there again, we are also at the question, what kind of knowledge? So if we are handed down certain parts and bits and pieces of knowledge that somebody tells us is the knowledge that we need to know, but then it doesn't help us at all with what we are actually needing, then we need to think about what kind of diverse knowledge is out there. And that's the point that I wanted to make centrally, is that the cultural diversity and the background knowledge that is generated through political mobilization, through getting together in local protests, often has something to offer that other places and other groups can learn from. So we need to come back to that coordination problem and probably try mapping knowledge that is being generated at different places, and not start from the center or from the top down, but start at where we note contestation about particular issues. So no de-skilling. I think that's relatively simple.
Okay, I just wanted to add a point. So when I said we need to sort of engage in sort of political education, what I don't mean by that is people like me standing and telling things to people. What I mean by that is precisely engagement in civic participation. It's learning by doing, not learning by being told stuff, that is the key thing here.
I'd just like to add just one little point. I went to 25 cities in Spain. I interviewed 213 activists that had actively occupied squares around the country. They did this for months. And one of the things that kept recurring was that, and it was coming from people with a lot of political experience, was that when those people with a lot of political experience arrived to the squares, they didn't know what to do. And the reason they didn't know what to do was because something different was happening. And it was actually people who hadn't been politicized who were actually organizing most of the stuff. So it's something that I think we should take into consideration. Perhaps this de-skilling from what, right? Yeah. And skilling ourselves in what, right? So just that.
Other questions? Comments?
So, I mean, the question was asked, are the citizens too dumb for democracy, as like being a bit facetious. And I thought to my, can you hear me? Yeah.
Sorry, would you mind starting from the beginning? We weren't able to hear you.
Okay, gotcha. Yeah, so, the question was asked, are the citizens too dumb for democracy? And obviously it was facetious, but I thought of my grandpa growing up in Cape Breton, very poor community, never went to university, worked in the mines his whole life, never owned a credit card out of principle, always voted for the Socialist Party there, and was the head of the credit union, and always fought for that. And I was, I guess, thinking, is the right... The right has learned to articulate the frustrations of the working class, and the left has not been able to, while previously, generations ago, it was the left who was able to do that, because the right has learned. If we look in Sweden, a country that actually, I think, donates the most per capita to, like, of their GDP to in aid, but they have now the Democratic Party. Canada has the People's Party. They're rebranding themselves as they've learned the language that the left used to have, and the left has lost grasp of it. So I guess my question is, how do we re-engage? I don't think it's a matter of intelligence, but it's how do we engage them and articulate their frustrations, because I think the left has been unable to in the past at least decade.
Yeah, I mean, one thing is that the right are much better at telling stories than the left, basically. That's partly because the right are much less worried about simplifying stories, and the left, you know, there's always this tendency to say, well, it's a bit more complicated than that. But that's a real problem, and it's a real problem, to go back to the first panel again, in our contemporary media context, in which compelling stories, compelling narratives, framed in relatively straightforward ways, are important. And I think, you know, we saw with Clinton and Blair and people a kind of attempt to do that, but very much a top-down attempt to do it. So actually what I think the left needs to do is, in a way, much more going onto the ground to actually understand what people's frustrations are, because it's not clear to me that the left actually have a good grasp of what the frustrations of, you know, post-industrial Northern England are, because, you know, as Peter Mandelson famously put it, they have no one else to vote for, so we don't need to worry about them. So this goes back to the decline of the party, because the ability of, in that sense, and the necessity for the party to listen, you know, when it's no longer a mass movement, that's taken away. We can now just do focus groups and look at the median voter and try and position ourselves. And also a lot of these people won't vote anyway. And if they will vote, they've got to vote for us because there's no one else. So I think we need some kind of humility on the left, and we actually need to go and talk to people about what do they understand by politics? What are their frustrations with the current system? In what ways do they feel that they're not being heard or listened to? Because, you know, quite a bit of the Brexit vote was a vote against central Westminster government for 30 years or 40 years of not listening to us and taking on to our concerns. So let's vote for this because surely it can't be any worse. To which the answer is, actually, it really can. But, you know, I mean, we just haven't listened enough, and that includes academics, where we've been doing our kind of theory top-down stuff, and not the kind of stuff Pablo's been doing, which is the kind of ethnographic work where you just go down to the floor and try and build it from the bottom by starting with what people are saying.
This right-left thing, I wonder, thinking as we're talking here and thinking from what I was learning with 15M, if we de-universalize representative democracy, if we stop thinking about everything being instrumental so we win elections, I wonder if that left-right divide is actually useful anymore. And the reason I ask that is because repeatedly in the squares, people enacting democratic participation were telling me that they didn't identify with this dichotomy of right and left. I know that there's also populist movements taking this idea and trying to, you know, somehow gain voters by eliminating that distinction. But I actually wonder if there is something, you know, about the value of we stop thinking on left-right divides, you know, and think about it in a different, try and imagine it in a different way. Because also a lot of it is, I think we lack political imagination. I think we're, as societies, I mean, it's not an individual attack to anyone, I think we are limiting ourselves to what is possible, right? It's like, well, we'll have to go with this party of the left or the right, but at the end of the day, there's lots of issues that you would maybe not agree with that party, but you end up voting for it because it, you know, you feel that you're more protected in your community. So just some thoughts that I wanted to put out.
Well, I think mainly it's not really necessarily a left-right issue. I mean, that might be due to my international relations sort of focus, but I think it's much more about a sense of alienation, and that's happening individually, and everybody feels less appreciated by a system that is increasingly over-regulated and under-cultured, if you wish. So, but the culture is something that we as individuals carry around with us, so it'll never leave us. It's something that we have generated, and something that we own. And if politics doesn't speak to that, then we have increasingly protest votes. So it doesn't necessarily mean that the left is better than this or the right is better than that. Obviously, if people feel deprived through over-regulation and sort of a distance from politics, then an easy story will always win the day. But the easy stories can be offered, and Britain is a very good example, from the left and the right in the same way. Germany is also a very good example, where you have populism emerging on both sides of the spectrum. So I think we need to bring our own experiences and value them to the fore in other ways. And there, of course, we require a change in the way politics is done.
I think we have time for one last question, online or...
Okay, well, there are a number of online questions. I'll pick one that follows up on this last little round of discussion, particularly on maybe the difference between connecting democratically at the level of affect or imagination versus knowledge. And Ron asks, any comments on the argument that we will only become serious about climate change if we are literally terrified by the possible scenarios if we don't take it seriously enough? And then I'd invite you to either comment specifically on climate change, or if you have further thoughts on the importance of affect, imagination, narrative, rather than simply knowledge in engaging the democratic public.
Well, maybe just, we have a cluster of excellence on climate change, on the potential, the possibilities that to counter climate change at the University of Hamburg, and we just won that now. And in that project, I'm conducting a sub-project, if you wish, on contestations of climate justice. And the project is actually allocated in the Arctic, and it's all about circumpolar governance and a diversity of stakeholders that does not correspond to the norm of sort of states engaging, but we bring a new diversity of issues and of questions of political agency to the fore, and to actually look at ways of contesting these norms. So that's one way of taking climate governance a step further, where we clearly, this entire cluster has been built on the acknowledgement that we know a lot. There are a lot of facts out there, especially generated by the MINT faculties, but the social science faculties have had very little chance to contribute to actually say, what do we do with these facts? And there again, we are back with the question of what are the facts and how do we actually act upon them?
I guess on the imagination point, because I think Pablo's, kind of partial rejoinder to me on, well, de-skilling from what and re-skilling for what is a really important point. And I just want to connect this back to the Jim Boer conversation. I say, there's been a kind of very arrogant attitude, which Britain certainly manifests, and I think a lot of the established democracies manifest, which is, we know what democracy is and we teach it to other people. We don't have anything to learn from them. But actually, I think in terms of political imagination and democratic imagination, a lot of societies which are much more recent democracies potentially have a lot to teach us, because they've already had to deal with some of the challenges that we're facing, or related challenges, or analogous challenges. Some of the most important innovations, think about things like participatory budgeting, came out of Brazil, came out of Porto Alegre and specific problems there. That's been a kind of important innovation taken up. There are others. So I think, again, this is about listening again, and it's about sort of looking for kind of exemplars of democratic activity, institutional imagination elsewhere that we can learn from, rather than starting from a position, hey, we the Brits, we invented democracy, forget about the Icelanders, it was us really, and we don't really have anything to learn from anybody else on this, because we do. We have no monopoly on wisdom, and as we're currently demonstrating, we may also have very little wisdom.
Well, about taking serious climate change, I don't know if we will take it seriously or not. I personally am an optimist, so I think societies have a great ability to, once they sort of get something, they move in that direction. I'm a big, I really believe in that. But I wonder, even if we take it seriously, can we actually overcome climate change from within capitalism? That would be my first question, right? And then my second question is actually one which I think, I've been thinking a lot about this, because I was listening to David Suzuki last week at UVic, and I noticed how everybody's rising up to do something about climate change, but I sense that there is something missing in the whole way we are discussing climate change, and I think it's a lack of solidarity. And what I mean by that is, how can we actually deal with such a humongous crisis as climate change when we live in a society which, in a distance of about 3 kilometers, has homeless people and then the uplands? I don't understand how we can think of ourselves being able to deal with climate change unless we deal with this. So.
I think we're out of time. But we're really hoping this is just going to be the start of many more conversations. Those of you that are online, feel free to post your questions or comments on the Facebook event page for this, or email the Center for Global Studies. We're getting something going on the website that we're calling Diablogs, so we'd like to encourage participation in that. Those of you that are here, we're having a reception right now for the next hour. We hope you'll stay and keep mingling and chatting with everybody. And I'd also like to, on behalf of Oliver Schmidtke and the Center for Global Studies, invite you all to an event we're having on Friday, Democracy and Its Futures, which will be bringing together leading theorists from around the world, including some of our own right here. Are to discuss different democratic traditions and the challenges and some of the solutions. And all the speakers here on the stage are going to be part of that. That's from 1:45 to 6 o'clock at the First People's House at UVic on the University of Victoria on Friday. There's a lot of thanks to make. Thank you so much to the speakers on both panels. I'd really like to actually acknowledge Beata Schmidtke, who did a huge amount of organizing for this event tonight. So thank you so much, Beata. Thank you to all the volunteers and to Stream of Consciousness for this generous grant you gave us for being here tonight. So, and bringing this to everyone who's here. And thanks to all of you for being here and participating. So let's let the conversation continue. Okay, thanks.